400 feet beneath the surface, a man is walking on the floor of the ocean. He is not supposed to be here. No one from his country is supposed to be here. These are Soviet waters. Above him, somewhere in the black, the Soviet Navy has laid a net of listening devices across the seabed, built to catch exactly what he is doing right now. And in front of him, half buried in the silt, is a cable, 5 inches thick, running for over 1,000 miles from a secret Soviet nuclear submarine base to Moscow's Pacific headquarters. Everything. The submarine hidden above him, the divers, the years of planning, one of the most valuable secrets the United States would ever steal. All of it comes down to this one man in the cold and the dark, reaching for that cable. For 10 years, it worked. For 10 years, the Americans listened to the Soviet Union's most secret conversations from the bottom of the sea, and the Soviets never knew. And then, one day, it was simply gone. The device vanished, and only a handful of people on Earth had ever known it existed. So how did the Soviets find a machine hidden 400 feet underwater in the middle of the ocean that almost no one knew about? The answer isn't in the water. It's a man and a debt. BLACKAXIOM. This is Operation Ivy Bells, the greatest wiretap in history and the betrayal that ended it. To understand why anyone would send a man to walk on the seafloor in enemy waters, you have to understand how blind both sides were. By 1970, the United States and the Soviet Union had enough nuclear weapons to end the world several times over, and neither one could see what the other was really doing. Then, American intelligence learned something that changed everything. The Soviets had built a brand new base, a nuclear submarine base, at a place called Petropavlovsk on a remote peninsula in the far east of Russia, thousands of miles from Moscow, perfectly placed to launch at the United States. The Americans needed to know what that base was capable of. The problem, there was no radio signal to intercept. A remote base like that had to talk to headquarters somehow, and radio would have been far too easy for the enemy to catch. One man thought he knew how they were doing it. His name was Captain James Bradley, and his idea was so strange that when he first said it out loud, it sounded impossible. Bradley believed the Soviets had run a telephone cable along the bottom of the Sea of Okhotsk, connecting the base to the mainland. An underwater line, buried in waters so deep and so heavily guarded that the Soviets would never imagine anyone could reach it. That confidence was the whole point. Because the Soviets felt so safe, Bradley suspected they weren't even bothering to encrypt what went through the cable. If he could reach it, he wouldn't just hear the Soviets, he'd hear them speaking plainly. But there was a problem that bordered on absurd. Bradley's solution came from his own childhood. He'd grown up near the Mississippi River, and he remembered the signs posted along the banks. Signs warning boats not to drop anchor because there were cables running underneath. Simple signs, common sense. He gambled that the Soviets would do the same thing, that somewhere along their coast, there would be signs telling their own fishermen, "Don't anchor here." Find the signs, and the signs would point to the cable. So in October 1971, a specially rebuilt submarine, the USS Halibut, slipped into forbidden Soviet waters to test a childhood memory against the might of the Soviet Navy. Getting the Halibut into the Sea of Okhotsk meant crossing a line no American vessel was allowed to cross. If they were caught, it wouldn't be an embarrassment. It could be an act of war. So the operation was buried under a lie. Officially, the Halibut was on a rescue and recovery mission. The Americans claimed they were hunting for the debris of a crashed Soviet missile to study it. The submarine even carried fake equipment bolted to its hull to sell the cover story. Rescue pods that weren't rescue pods at all. They were chambers to let divers out into the sea. They crept up the coast, watching the shoreline through a periscope, day after day. And then they saw it, a sign on the Russian shore warning fishermen away from a stretch of water. Bradley had been right. A memory from the Mississippi had just located a Soviet military cable on the other side of the world. Once they knew where to look, it took only days to find the cable itself, lying on the seabed 400 feet down. Now came the part that had never been done before. Here was the final problem, and it was the hardest one. How do you tap a cable without cutting it? Cut into it, splice a wire, and the Soviets would see the damage the moment anything went wrong. The whole thing would be blown instantly. Bradley's answer was a device that never touched the wire inside at all. It worked on induction. No cut, no splice, no trace. It simply listened to the echo of the signal and recorded it onto tape, and it had one more piece of genius built in. If the Soviets ever hauled the cable up for repairs, the device was designed to release itself and drop harmlessly to the seabed, leaving the cable clean and the secret intact. The divers clamped it into place, and the listening began. Every month, the submarine would return. Divers would make that freezing descent again, swap the tapes, replace the batteries, and vanish back into the dark. Then the tapes went home to an NSA analyst who spoke fluent Russian, whose job was to sit and listen to everything the device had caught. His name was Ronald Pelton. Remember that name. If you want to see how the most secret operation of the Cold War got undone from the inside, stay with me, because this is where it turns. When the first tapes were decoded, the Americans could barely believe what they were hearing. Bradley's gamble had paid off beyond anything he'd imagined. The Soviets weren't encrypting. They were talking openly, thousands of conversations, high-ranking officers speaking plainly about their nuclear weapons, how far their missiles could reach, how ready they were to fire. For nearly 10 years, this one machine, sitting silently on a cable at the bottom of the sea, fed the United States a stream of the Soviet Union's most guarded secrets. It shaped how American presidents understood their enemy. It was, by almost any measure, one of the most successful espionage operations in history, and it was about to be destroyed, not by a better machine, by a man who needed $35,000. By 1980, the analyst who had listened to those tapes, Ronald Pelton, was finished. He had left the NSA. His finances had collapsed. He was bankrupt, buried under debts of more than $60,000, with no way out that he could see. So he found one. In January 1980, Pelton picked up a phone and called the Soviet embassy in Washington. He didn't give his name. He said only that he worked for the US government and that he had things worth knowing. The KGB officer who took that call gave a fake name, Vladimir Sorokin. His real name was Vitaly Yurchenko. Remember him too. The next evening, Pelton walked into the Soviet embassy, and he began to sell. And among everything he told them was the one thing that mattered most. That 400 feet under the Sea of Okhotsk, wrapped around their own cable, was an American machine that had been listening to them for a decade. For all of it, for handing over the crown jewel of American intelligence. The Soviets paid Ronald Pelton $35,000. Of that, the piece about the underwater tap was worth, to them, around $5,000 for the secret that a submarine crew had risked their lives in freezing enemy waters to protect month after month for 10 years. And here is the part almost no one knows. The FBI had been listening to the Soviet embassy's phone lines the whole time. They heard Pelton's very first call. They even filmed a sandy-haired, bearded man walking into the embassy that January evening. They had him on tape, on film, and they had no idea who he was. The Soviets didn't move right away. For months, the tap kept running. The Americans kept listening, none of them knowing the secret was already gone. Then, in 1981, American satellites picked up something that made no sense. A cluster of Soviet ships, including a salvage vessel, the kind you send to pull something up from the deep, sitting on the surface directly above the tap. The US scrambled a submarine, the USS Parsh, to recover the device before the Soviets could. They were too late. When the divers reached the cable, the machine was gone. 6 tons of top-secret American engineering, lifted off the seabed and carried away. The Soviets had it. And to this day, that device sits in a museum in Moscow, a trophy behind glass. But back in America, one question consumed the intelligence community. Only a handful of people had known about that machine. So how had the Soviets walked straight to it? For 4 years, they had no answer. The answer, when it came, arrived through a betrayal of its own. In 1985, a senior KGB colonel slipped away from his colleagues while traveling through Rome, walked into the US embassy, and asked to defect. His name was Vitaly Yurchenko, the same KGB officer who, 5 years earlier, had taken Ronald Pelton's very first phone call. The Americans flew him to a safe house and began to question him. And Yurchenko gave them a thread. He didn't have a name, but he told them the man who had betrayed the underwater operation was an NSA analyst, with reddish hair. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Investigators pulled the old recording of that 1980 phone call, the one the FBI had captured and never been able to place. They built a list of NSA analysts who fit, and the voice on the tape matched one man, Ronald Pelton. In November 1985, they arrested him. He confessed almost at once. He was convicted on 9 counts of espionage and sentenced to 3 life sentences. He would spend 30 years in prison. At the time, one of the longest sentences ever handed down for spying in American history. The KGB man's betrayal had caught the NSA man's betrayal. 2 men who each sold out their own side, and one of them, without ever meaning to, delivered the other. For years, people have told this story as a triumph of engineering. The impossible tap, the device that touched nothing, the decade of perfect secrecy 400 feet down. But that's not really what this story's about. The Soviets never beat the machine. They never cracked the induction sleeve, never detected the submarine, never found the flaw in Bradley's design. The most sophisticated wiretap of the Cold War was never defeated by better technology. It was defeated by a $60,000 debt, a man who needed money and decided his country's greatest secret was worth about the price of a car. The tap was never really on the cable. It was always on the people who knew about it. And Ronald Pelton was not the last insider to figure out that a secret is only ever worth what someone is desperate enough to sell it for. We're going to tell you about the next one. This has been BLACKAXIOM, Decode the World.